Hello, and welcome to the Gravel Ride podcast, where we go deep on the sport of gravel cycling through in-depth interviews with product designers, event organizers, and athletes who are pioneering the sport. I'm your host, Craig Dalton, a lifelong cyclist who discovered gravel cycling back in 2016 and made all the mistakes you don't need to make. I approach each episode as a beginner to unlock all the knowledge you need to become a great gravel cyclist. This week on the broadcast, I bring you Jonathan Hornell-Kennedy from Frameworks out of Canada. You might have heard Jonathan briefly on the podcast when I did one of my Made bicycle show recap shows. I was captivated by his designs at the show as they were relatively unique amongst a field of titanium and steel welded bicycles. I'd been familiar with lugged carbon construction from a number of other builders along the years, but I hadn't seen his particular approach. And after following him on Instagram, which I definitely recommend you do, I became enamored with the manufacturing process. So I was excited to have him back on board to learn a little bit more about his history. He's a relative newcomer to the world of bicycling, which I think always yields interesting and innovative approaches to things that builders who have been around forever might not care to revisit as an approach. So I'm excited to have this conversation. Before we jump in, I do need to thank this week's sponsor, Hammerhead, and the Hammerhead Karoo 2 computer. Maybe you've been thinking about updating your gravel cycling GPS computer this time of year. The Hammerhead Karoo 2 is the most advanced GPS cycling computer available today, with industry-leading mapping, navigation, and routing capabilities that set it apart from other GPS options. It has free global maps with points of interest included, like cafes and campsites, so you can explore with confidence and on-the-go flexibility. One of the things I always talk about when talking about my Hammerhead Karoo 2 is the ongoing software updates that they ship. You never have to feel left behind from a new feature coming out in the world, because the team at Hammerhead are always looking to improve the device. The climber feature is one that I always call out, as it notably has this predictive path technology, which lets you visualize for the upcoming gradient changes in real time with or without a route loaded. That is something that I particularly lean on when I'm doing an event in terrain that I don't have familiarity with, or I'm on some sort of adventure ride. For me, I really just love to see what's ahead of me in the climb so I can just think about my cadence and effort level, etc. The other big update that I saw come through was around this new e-bike integration, which brings detailed battery usage data right onto the display. As a new owner of an eMTB, I'm excited to explore this feature because I do have a bit of range anxiety. So having those battery details right in the display unit, by which you can access via a specific persona on the head unit, so I can switch between things I need on an e-bike ride versus things I need on a traditional gravel ride. Anyway, I encourage you to give the Karoo 2 a look. Right now, our listeners can get a free heart rate monitor with the purchase of a Hammerhead Karoo 2. Just visit hammerhead.io right now and use the promo code TheGravelRide at checkout today. This is an exclusive offer for my listeners, so don't forget that promo code, TheGravelRide. You'll get a free heart rate monitor with your purchase of a Karoo 2. Just go to hammerhead.io today, add both items to your cart, and use that promo code, TheGravelRide. With that business behind us, let's jump right into my conversation with Jonathan. Jonathan, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have this conversation after we originally connected at the Made show in Portland, Oregon. Super cool. I thought your product was one of the more interesting products I saw in that entire show. So I'm stoked to give the listeners a little bit more insight as to your background and what Frameworks is all about.
Thanks for saying that. That's nice of you. Yeah, it's kind of the tired story at this point. Someone with a passion in bikes and who makes things for a living decides to combine those two to their life and see what happens.
Jonathan, where'd you grow up and how did you discover cycling in the first place?
So I'm a native Southern Ontarian up here in Canada. I was born in Toronto and have lived within a few hours of Toronto my entire life. So started biking just, when you're parents kind of teach you how to ride a two-wheeler kind of thing in the school field. Well, I was probably like 6 or 7 at that point. Um, and we moved out of the city when I was 7 and into a more, well, we were still in a town, but I would say a more suburban kind of town. So biking around the neighborhoods and going to see your friends and stuff, kind of a little bit of escaping
Yeah.
mom and dad's supervision. Uh, and then just started kind of like loosely mountain biking. I had like a giant hardtail for my whole like biking career from age 12 to when I left for university. So go on, jump off of stuff, try and jump over logs, whatever. Just being a goof with buddies. And then in university, I that was like what, early 2000s. There was kind of like
Yeah.
the original fixie craze. I feel like there's
It
another
comes
one
in
happening
waves.
right now. So started riding a fixie. Yeah. I don't know. It's cyclical, I'm sure. Um, so started riding a fixie then to get around town, and that was the last bike I purchased before I made one for myself.
And we
I studied a somewhat esoteric field of statistics
okay.
called like financial math. So it was taught in the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Sciences at the university I went to. So that's like the people who do insurance math, basically figuring out how much your life insurance policy should cost based
Yeah.
on statistics and market values and things like that. So so I was at school for quite a while. 7 years, I think, studying that. I have a master's degree in it, and then ended up doing nothing with that degree in practical use. Like I should have been working as like a
Right.
finance math kind of guy, so didn't really
And then you had
speak
mentioned,
to me.
you had that fixed gear bike that was the only one you had, and the next one was one you built
Yeah.
yourself. That's for most of us, that's quite a massive leap in journey. What was going on there? I mean, had you developed sort of a passion for the sport of cycling, or was it more the idea of frame building? And how did you even begin to acquire the skills to manufacture your first bike?
Yeah, so that's maybe where the academic journey ends, and then what I've done to earn a living commenced after that. My wife and I own and operate a machine shop, and what we started the business with was again another esoteric thing. Pattern making is what it's called, and that's the trade that is involved with making the tools that foundries
Gotcha.
use
And how
to
did
produce castings.
I'm
That
curious,
wording
Jonathan.
is a
So
little clunky.
how did you even see that as an opportunity? Did either of you have, ties into the manufacturing world to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely. So my dad is a
Gotcha.
mechanical engineer by education, and he owns and operates a company that um, basically repairs, refurbishes, remakes large industrial pumps. Um, so they oftentimes begin life as a casting, like a large chunk of
Okay.
iron or steel or bronze, whatever it might be. So when I was done university and kind of doing a little bit of soul searching, a friend of mine who's a few years older and was sort of not thrilled with the job he had, I would say, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, but was looking for a change. Um, he's a civil engineer by training, and approached my dad because he knew he was self-employed and said, "Hey Pat, what do you think of like going out on my own? Got any ideas? I'm a pretty handy guy." And my dad said to him, like, "Hey, I think you should look into pattern making. The guys are all old. You really can't go to school to learn
Yeah.
that stuff. It's all sort of apprenticeship based, and they're kind of phasing out their businesses. So there could be an opportunity there." So Stefan, my friend, and I took like a night class at a local community college to learn how to do 3D modeling, and was kind of pretty handy with SolidWorks. And the modern way of making patterns is to use CNC machines to carve 3D shapes, typically out of like blocks of foam or wood or tooling board, it's called, which is like a hard plastic. And those objects that you create are what the foundry uses to create their sand molds.
Yeah.
So picture like a cast iron frying pan. The way that's made is they melt iron in a pot and they pour it into a
Gotcha.
mold that's made out of sand. and the mold has the shape of the cast iron frying pan inside of it. So my obligation, or sort of the service that we offered, was not only to produce the tooling, but I was also like, you have to design it to work for the foundry. So cast iron frying pan's a relatively simple object, but we got, over the years, as my skill set grew, got involved with some relatively complicated castings for like world leading aerospace foundries. And so yeah, Stefan and I ran the business together for about a year and a bit. He was living in a different, like, he lived in Toronto proper. We're in Hamilton, which is about an hour outside. And um, he had his first kid in that time, and I was like super hungry to get the business going. And so we were kind of on different paces, and there's a little bit of friction that resulted because of that. So we parted ways, and then we're still good friends. But I kind of ran the business on my own, and then my wife Elise came on as we started to grow a bit, move facilities, and then started to expand more out of just pattern making to do machining as well, which is, a lot of times foundries have these metal castings that they produce that are relatively intricate shapes that need some more precise operations carried out on them. You could, like, an example might be like an engine block in a car, or a turbocharger, like objects that people think of more readily than some other things I got involved with. So you've got this object that's relatively crude when it comes out of the foundry, and it might need a bearing put in it or threads added so you can bolt it together. So that's an operation that typically happens in some sort of machining setup. So we had this customer base of all these foundries that trusted us to make these relatively complicated things. Like, patterns are big, like organic shapes, lots of 3D things that need to be accurate and go together and work. So it was a pretty easy thing for us to say to them, hey, you trust us to do this. Would you allow us to machine your castings for you? Like, can we quote on that work? And the idea for us there was kind of more repeat business. The thing about a pattern tool is you only make one of them. Hopefully the customer is not coming back to you for another one right away, because the idea with a mold or a tool or something of that nature is that it costs a lot of money to make, but it allows you to make a ton of parts. So think of that as like a mold for a carbon fiber frame. It's the same kind of idea. You've got this thing that costs a lot of money, is really complicated, but it allows you to put a basic material into it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then in your example of like the engine block, they would have pulled something out of the mold that was a bit rough around the edges, maybe not as precise as it needed to be to fit. You would bring it back into your CNC capabilities and really use the tool to make precise edges and cuts and shapes around the basic block.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and like a lot of that stuff would have happened more historically in the cycling industry, when they used a lot of investment castings for lugs and things like that, or a lot of that type of product has moved away, like in favor of probably more cost competitive and superior products. But yeah, like there would have been a whole bunch of examples, I'm sure, old shift levers and things like that, die castings. That
I remember. I certainly remember in the early days of mountain biking, the wave of CNC machined parts that came out, preferably color anodized, that were all the rage at the time. Yeah.
So that's sort of the story. And then we got involved in injection molding and doing work for the government during COVID to make PCR testing consumables. So that involved like some pretty complicated work in terms of reverse engineering, plastic components, getting a clean room set up, injection
mold. And was that additional equipment that you invested in at the time?
So we got a grant from the government to set it up. So we had to put some capital into it for sure. That's how it worked. But, we felt like we're definitely doing the right thing when North America was kind of running out of those parts. The whole world was running out of them, because when did like they ever see a demand spike like that in terms of lab consumables, right? So we got that up and running, and then worked our butts off for 2 years to make it all happen. And then that's kind of what I would say gave me the financial freedom.
So that brings us to maybe what, 2022?
Honestly, man, the whole pandemic is a blur in terms of timelines. I think so. That sounds about right. I would say July of 2022 is when we shipped our last part to fulfill
Yeah.
the order to the government. And yeah, that's when
And
I
was
really
there
went
a
full bore on the
driver
bike stuff.
behind you saying like, "Oh, I want to make a bike"? Had you like increased your cycling during the pandemic? Yeah,
Yeah, so it's another pandemic story of, I'm sure
for
you
sure.
remember trying to buy bike stuff. So yeah, the all along I've always had a passion for making things, right? Like using my hands to create an object. Like I when I was in school, I worked in like fine dining restaurants, like 40 hours a week. That was kind of my first form of, trading my time for money in terms of making things. So the shop that I've built up over the years, I've got some really nice equipment. I've paid for it all out of
Yeah.
cash flow by doing other people's work, and I've always wanted a product line of my own stuff. Um, Not that I don't like working with other people, and you're certainly exposed to a lot of really interesting and challenging problems to solve when other people are bringing you their stuff. But it's a bit of a like, everybody's got masters. Even when I start making my own product, I've got to sell it now, so that's a whole other thing. But um, yeah, it's a bit of a always wanted to make something, and I've always been into bikes, so that's what I was saying earlier. Kind of combine those two things, and the big push was, yeah, just not being able to buy a new bike
And
during the pandemic. I was riding to
and
work a
given the
lot,
equipment that you
so
had in hand at that time, can you describe the bike that you were able to make?
yeah. Yeah, well, I had originally thought, like, I'm watching Cobra Frameworks Cobra Frame Building's YouTube channel, how to weld a bike, and I ordered a bunch of chromoly tubing. I've got welding equipment here and milling machines. So I was like, I'm gonna just make myself a bike, and that's it, right? Like that's gonna be it'll be a piece of junk because I'm not that good at welding and I've never done one before, but it'll be the thing
Yeah.
that I made and I'm riding it, and that's cool. Um, and then the tube sat on the shelf for like 2 years because it's like that's not what I do, right? That's not my. It felt like too fussy. I was going to have to be like sitting at a welding table filing things. So the bike that I decided to make was a format that is gaining popularity right now with the advent of 3D printing, which
Yeah.
is a lugged construction frame, where the lugs are alloy and I'm using carbon fiber tubes. So I had actually originally, like, I'm really good at 3D modeling. That's one of my main skill sets. So designing the bike took like a day, less than that. And then I was going to have the lugs printed,
Okay.
like 3D printed, like everyone else is doing. It's a pretty, um, in comparison to CNC machine shops that could produce a part like that in terms of intricacy, it's relatively easy to find vendors that do 3D printing as a job shopping service. Like that's kind of the
Yeah.
main
And are
business
those
for those
3D
machines
printing
right now. So,
are they printing in
and we
titanium or
work with
aluminum or both? Okay.
both. There's stainless steels, there's all sorts of alloys coming out, there's different forms of printing. And then because we do aerospace work, like we had our aerospace designation working with foundries and machine shops that do that type of stuff. We're involved with some of the like Canadian leaders in terms of operating that equipment and having those processes validated. So I sent them to the engineers and they said, "You're not actually going to ride that thing, are you?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to ride it." And I'm like, "Well, I don't know if we would." Like, "What do you mean?" And that's when I started to like do a bit more research into the metallurgy of 3D prints, and would have needed to beef them up more than I thought to get it to work. But the main thing that floored me
Yeah, because
was
I
the
often,
cost on the
when I see
prints.
companies using the 3D
Um,
printing, it's
so there's
often
some
around the rear dropout. They might highlight that they're doing it back there, but I don't recall of anybody doing a head tube, for example, in the 3D printing style.
most head tubes on bikes that are lugged with 3D prints, they actually segment a piece of carbon in there
Gotcha.
in between, or a piece of titanium
Yeah.
pipe and weld it at the two ends, because that particular shape might actually exceed the build volume of some printers. It's not that that cost wise it doesn't make sense. It's that you're literally talking about a little microwave oven. So they've
Yeah.
got to cram all the lugs into there. And it's the build volume might be like 9-10 inches cubed. So if you've got a head tube in there that's, for a taller person, it just won't even fit. So yeah, there was the structural element is one thing, it can be overcome. The what floored me was the cost. These guys are like often engineers are also in gear guys, right? And they're into cars and biking and stuff like that. So a lot of them knew of these brands that are doing it, and they're kind of saying like, uh, I don't know, we can't with our own cost structure on what it costs to operate these machines and kind of how long it takes to print something, we don't get it. So then I kind of went, okay, you know what? For that amount of money that we're talking, just to build myself a bike, I can just take a couple blocks of aluminum that I have on the shelf and sacrifice a few days of my
Right.
life to see if I can machine them. So I made myself a fixie that that was the first bike, and I just bought carbon tubes from McMaster Car, like carbon fiber tubes. McMaster Car is like I don't know,
Yeah.
the Amazon of
Sure.
industrial ordering. So they're awesome. And they've got everything next day shipping kind of thing. So I got all this stuff and I glued the thing up manually, and then I started riding it around town and going out to group rides, which I hadn't done before. And people started asking questions about it. You know, most bike people they pay attention to stuff like that, whether it's a
Yeah.
style of bike they would ever ride
Yeah.
themselves. Maybe not the case,
Un-
but they know, right? And like
Unquestionably, like the
everyone's got their
frameworks, your bicycles
yeah,
have a very distinct look that is going to get people to ask questions. And for the listener, maybe who isn't able to kind of visualize what a lugged construction looks like, you've got the head tube with a little bit of kind of aluminum coming out for the down tube and the top tube. You've got another lug and bottom bracket set up in a similar fashion, and similarly around the seat tube and the rear stay, and the carbon fiber tube basically goes inside that aluminum, that lug, as we're talking about, and is bonded together in some way to kind of create the frame. Is that somewhat accurate, Jonathan?
I think that's a pretty good
I've never
description.
thought about
Yeah, for
describing
sure.
lugs to someone in their
It's like
ears,
plug and
not
play,
looking at a
right?
picture.
Yeah, like
Colnago.
Colagno. I don't know how to say the name properly.
Yeah.
Like even their Colnago. There you go. Their carbon fiber bikes are lugged, so it's just like there's a step. Like most bikes, carbon
Yeah.
fiber bikes are made in multiple pieces. They just seam them and sand them, and you don't see it because it's under the paint, or they might do
Yeah.
clear coat and you see
Yeah,
like a little
exactly.
overwrap or something. But yeah, anyways, there's a bit of a step, and it's the first bike it's like bright aluminum. I just left it raw. I didn't put any of the kind of plating that
Yeah.
we do on the ones you would have seen. And I used like a more old school looking carbon fiber with
Yeah.
like a checkered weave. So it's like quite, yeah. And it's built like a steel bike, like skinny tubes, like I think inch and an eighth or inch and a quarter down tube. Like, yeah. So I started riding it around. People were saying like, hey, like go look at, then they list brands X, Y, and Z. Go look at those guys and what they're charging for a bike. And I thought, like, holy cow, like that's I could do this again and charge less than that and make a pretty good go of it. So that's when I kind of went like, okay, maybe I should try to spend a bit more time not doing it as a one-off, but think about how I would build it with the skill set and resources that I have at my disposal, and to kind of rethink the construction methodology a bit. So as much as my bike is like a object at the end, what I really focus on when I'm thinking about the bike is everything that goes into making it and optimizing the design so that it can produce the best possible result in a really predictable manner
Yeah.
from a
Yeah. And
manufacturing
in riding
perspective.
that first fixed gear bike and using those off the shelf carbon fiber tubes, did you kind of recognize something in the tubing that left something to be desired?
Is
Yeah.
this like leading towards why I started making my own tubes? Yeah. So yeah, they're roll wrapped. So that's a process where you take sheets of pre-preg cloth and picture like rolling pastry on a rolling pin. You've got a 2D sheet on your table and you roll it over. So you're kind of at like you're constrained to what the fabric itself will allow you to do in terms of laying the fiber in certain orientations
Yeah.
and what resin is already in it. Um, so it makes a more limited tube in terms of strength. The Honestly, the main motivating factor for me starting to wind the tubes in house was that sourcing stuff in Canada can be problematic. We're a relatively small economy, and like there's the border. So all these tubes that I had access to were coming out of the
Yeah.
States. I'm paying import duties on them. I'm paying in a currency that's worth a lot more than ours. So when I looked at what it was going to cost me to buy a set of tubes from Rock West, which is what I made the first bunch of bikes with, like I was working with them on the tubing. Um, I just thought like, okay, maybe I can, if the whole idea is to try to optimize the process and drive costs down a bit, I thought I got to do this in house, right? Like the tubes were costing me a lot more than
Okay.
the aluminum that goes into the bike. And that's like aerospace grade coming from a certified mill with traceability certs, and it's good stuff. So um, then there's the option of like when you're using, or option, that's the wrong word, sorry, there's the limitation that when you're buying an off-the-shelf product, you're
Yeah.
constrained to how that is made, right? So the tubes I could have specced out to Rock West like, hey, could you make me the tubes with this recipe, and they'd say yes. But one thing I wanted to maintain, um, as wide open the variable set as possible, was like making
Right.
bikes customizable, right? So like say you're talking to a frame builder that's using any type of alloy, they're at the mercy of what tubes they can buy. They can't tune beyond that, right? They can maybe squish them a little bit or change the shape of them to get some different bending compliance in them, but the material is what it is. So with internalizing the tube manufacturing, I've got a considerable amount of control over making the tubes behave differently. So it looks like a fairly basic bike in profile. It looks kind of as like a classical shape in terms of if you overlaid a welded steel bike
Right.
over it, they'd almost look the same, right? Like I use a relatively large down tube, but what I wanted, like I think carbon fiber is an excellent material, but to produce a carbon fiber bike in a traditional sense, you need a mold, and then you're not doing
Yeah.
custom
Can
geometry at that point, right? So I wanted to maintain the ability for every bike to be both custom geometry and have a lot of the benefits of
can
carbon
you
in terms
describe
of
what
tuning the
the
layout.
filament wound carbon fiber? What's that process like?
Yeah, so instead of roll wrapping, where you're taking pre-preg sheets, you have a machine. It's like a CNC machine that I built, that operates like a lathe. So a lathe is where you have a spinning thing on a single axis rotating and something tracing back and forth along it. So I've got a mandrel that's spinning, and I like a spool of carbon fiber is on this carriage, and it goes back and forth, and I can basically roll or wind the single strand of carbon fiber onto this tube. So I got to do the math again. I did it a few months ago and I forget the number, but I think to make a tube set for a bike, there's like 20,000
Okay.
linear feet that I lay up in a really precise manner. So we build up the tube in layers, and we can have different layers for different tubes, different rider thicknesses. And then what the winder allows me to do is put the fiber down in different orientations. So like I don't have to buy pre-preg fabric from someone where it's only unidirectional or it's only
Yeah.
45 or 90. I can go any angle I want and put down as much or as little as I want in certain areas, and that's all
And to
done
use
without a
that
human.
sort of pastry analysis
So it
comparison you used, is there the equivalent of the rolling pin inside that you remove at the end
yeah.
after it's sort of wound into shape?
Yeah. So our that's where our process is differentiated once again from people who roll wrap is I don't cure on the mandrel. So most production roll wrapping places or other frame builder or sorry, filament wound tubes, what they do is they have a really precise rod
Yeah.
that they wind onto the mandrel, and then whether it's you can use, so just to really muddy this a bit more, you can use two forms of fiber to it. You can have pre-preg fiber, so it's a single strand with the resin already in it, or you can do what I'm doing, which is wet winding, where I buy dry spools of fiber and then I'm mixing my own resin, and the fiber gets
Okay.
wetted on the way to the mandrel. Both systems require a cure cycle after to set the resin, but with the pre-preg toe, you're subjected to the same constraints that pre-preg is in terms of, needing to store the stuff in a freezer. It has a shelf life. You've got no say over the resin whatsoever. So for us, I can mix and match the recipe for whatever I want. We use some really high performance resins, and that's something that I think, the bike industry doesn't talk a lot about. They talk about the fiber. I've got Toray T1100 in my frame or ultra high mod in my frame here, but no one talks about the stuff that actually holds it all together, which is the
Yeah, I've
matrix
never
or
heard of it
resin or
beyond a
epoxy.
technical discussion.
So we spend a lot of time working on
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah, I would encourage
Yeah.
the
So
listener
the
while they're listening
what?
to this in their earphones to go onto your Instagram account, because a lot of this discussion will become more visual if you start looking through some of the Framework Bikes Instagram stories. You'll get sucked into this process, and everything Jonathan's saying will come together visually for you.
I appreciate the plug. So I think the question I'm taking a really long time to answer is like, what happens once the fiber is on the rod? Most places, what they do is to get some amount of consolidation is they wrap tape over it once it's on the mandrel, kind of like wrapping a hockey stick or a golf club grip or a tennis racket or whatever. So they've got an additional head that has what looks like packing tape, and they pull on it kind of hard and then try and wrap it under tension to consolidate that fiber down onto the mandrel. Then that whole thing goes in an oven. Some guys will vacuum bag it depending on what you're doing. So that means they put a big plastic sleeve over it and pull vacuum on the sleeve. So that'll give you, I think it works out to about 14 psi of consolidation. And then they have to remove the rod from the carbon fiber once it's cured, pull it out the end, and you're left with your final carbon fiber tube. So what we do that's a little different is while the fiber is still wet, like the epoxy glue hasn't set up yet, I slide it off the mandrel and then I place it into a mold, like a mold that has two hemispheres in it. So I slip a bladder inside of it and then expand the fiber into the mold to give it a really accurate shape and much higher consolidation than you can achieve with
Got it.
traditional filament winding.
Interesting. You mentioned you.
So that there's a few motivations for that. One is to get like a much higher quality product without, because when you're wet winding, air and stuff gets worked in. It's really hard to avoid little micro air bubbles, and tiny little air bubbles in carbon fiber is what causes the material to break down over time more rapidly. It's if the plastic starts to fatigue, the fibers get overworked, and then the thing kind of breaks down. So the higher quality you can make the product coming out of the mold, the longer it's going to last, the better performance you get out of it. The other thing for us is I wanted really accurate diameter on the outside of the tube because that's how we glue it into the lugs. So if you can imagine the process that I described where you tape the outside of it, you're left with a fairly coarse outer surface on your filament wound tube. So most people have to sand it quite heavily to get it either dimensionally accurate or, looking good. So that's another step I wanted to avoid. Like my whole thing is about trying to minimize the amount of human hours.
Yeah, I think when many of us
on
look
bike.
around our garages at the carbon fiber frames, clearly like they must have been sanded, and then obviously like the paint and everything gets it smoothed over, so you don't see. If anybody's seen like a raw construction of a carbon fiber frame, they look a lot rougher around the edges than the finished painted products do. But in your case, there's nowhere to hide. The product is everything.
You could what you could do to rectify it, and I think some other builders do need to do this, is like you've got little pinholes everywhere, you've got little wrinkles in the surface, you lay on a clear coat, you mix up your epoxy or some other finishing agent, you lay it down, and then you sand it. And then you repeat that process 3 or 4 times until you've got something that looks really nice. But you can kind of think of it as like the mosquito trapped in amber. There's like your carbon fiber tube is in there, but you have layers of extra resin and clear coat on the outside to make it look pristine, but there's actually a lot of like little plastic and paint on the outside.
So we've given the listener a little bit of an understanding of like the process that you go through and all your background as a machine shop first and why you became suited to kind of create these frames. With the process you have today, what does a customer engagement look like? How do they work with you? How do you leverage all of that customization capability you've just described to create a unique ride property for a customer's bike?
That's a question that I don't think I have a satisfying answer to for most people. I'm coming to this from an extremely technical background where like you have to measure and prove everything, and ride feel is totally subjective. There's no industry standard guidelines for how you test for ride feel. So people will say to me, "Oh, I'd ride your bike if you could talk more," or "I'd buy a bike from you if you talk more about how it feels," and all these things. So I would say my thesis on it is that torsional stiffness is really important. So again, coming back, there's so many layers of like I could go into techie deep dives on everything, but the torsional strength you can get from a filament wound product is like exceptionally high. It's how they make like really high performing motorsport drive shafts and stuff like that. So torsion refers to how much
Yeah.
twisting the down tube can handle, basically. That's the main structural element there. So if you wanted to make an object that had the same strength as our down tubes and sort of in terms of torsion, they would be really stiff in all your other dimensions, right? It would be an uncomfortable bike to ride. So I really focus on like speed and comfort, I would say. And you'd think those things might be at odds with one another, but the efficiencies from sort of the bike not wanting to twist, like, yeah, when you pull on the handlebars and push on the bottom bracket, you're trying
Yeah.
to torque the down tube, right? So I can make that strong enough to resist that you're not being inefficient during pedaling or riding, and you're going to corner well, but it's not unnecessarily stiff in plane, so you don't get like a chattery feel when you're going over bumps. So yeah, but I don't have an answer that I think is satisfying. I honestly, I was researching this last night, going through like academic literature for what places, like where do you put
Yeah.
accelerometers and strain gauges on a bike to try and figure out ride feel, and there's no answer. And then even if I come up with a rigorous testing methodology, I say my bike's a 7. Like, what does that mean to you, Craig, when you're going to buy it, right? So I think within custom frames, the customer is taking a little bit of a risk because they can't go to the showroom floor and try my bike, right? And even if they did try my bike that was built for a different rider, there's no guarantee that the one I make is going to be, I'm not a mind reader and a psychic. I don't know how to translate those things. But for people who are very concerned about that, I don't have a satisfying answer. I don't think I can't tell them I can make you exactly what you want. The things we look at are your weight, your riding style, your preferences in terms of stiffness, like just having a sort of verbal conversation about that, like describe what you're looking for, your power output, like FTP, things like that. Yeah, and
Is
then
the
we
challenge with
kind of
your
go from there.
process that you can make it overly stiff and it's backing it off to the
No, I don't think we'd ever be able to.
yeah,
I maybe could if I redesign things, but no, we're not going to be like, early 2000s. You
right.
feel like you're riding a board. That's like our tube profiles in a lot of places are slender. Our chain stays are small. They're strong. They're very strong. But I think if you're someone who comes from riding like pretty hardcore road bikes or like time trial bikes, our bike is not going to feel
Yeah.
um, too stiff to you. There's no, I'm making something that I want to ride for a couple hours and have fun on, and we can stiffen things up for sure if that's what you're looking for. But I, like there's the whole conversation of pedaling efficiency, aero gains, all those type of things. Like I'm not making a type of bike that anyone is going to race on, right? Like people who are racing and are concerned about aero gains and drivetrain efficiency and all that stuff are they're probably they want to be on the BMC or the Canyon or the Factor or whatever other guys are racing on. So for me to try to tailor the bike construction methodology to capture that little bit more of the market, even if I had a product that met their needs, I don't think I'd have a very easy time selling it because it's not got it's not what other people are racing. So yeah, I've tried to make a bike that is really enjoyable for most people. Like even if you are a serious racer, train on one of our bikes, you're going to have a lot more
Yeah. Yeah.
fun, you know?
Interesting. So, I mean, just to be clear, so for the would-be gravel cyclist looking at one of your gravel frames, what size tire clearance can you get? And do you
Yeah.
sort of in your mind say this is an all-around gravel bike. This is going to get it in the sweet spot of you can do almost everything from including racing with it to, your local group ride, gravel rides, etc.
Yeah, I think that comes down to what you define a gravel bike as, right? So because everything is custom geometry, I can take it from being basically like a 90s, late 80s mountain bike to, yeah, basically a super fast road bike that you
Yeah.
can fit gravel tires on, right? Like I can do the whole spectrum. So I kind of didn't answer this part of the question that you asked about what the customer experience is like. Everything we do is like, I haven't made two bikes that are the same yet, right? And I'm on about like 20 at this point. So we can do all your normal fit stuff, but then again, the question of tire clearance, drivetrain, impingement. Um, I'd say we would have a tough time stuffing a 50 millimeter tire in with a 2x drivetrain. With a 1x, no problem. upfront. So we're a
Yeah.
classified
Sure.
OEM. I don't know if you're familiar with those,
Yeah.
the internal shifting hub. So if people like really want huge tire clearance and 2x, that's like one of the things I can lean on there. But yeah, like I think I've made myself kind of an all-road gravel leaning bike and a gravel bike that's got a really slack head tube, and I ride it with 45s on it all the time. So yeah, we can kind of do whatever you're looking for. I think gravel as a segment has a lot more
For sure.
variability than like a road bike. There's fast gravel,
Yeah.
whatever, slack bike packing type gravel. So yeah, we can kind of do anything really, and that is one of the challenges we have. Is like, okay, I'm telling you about how diverse our system is in terms of its output, and we can tune tubes and all this stuff. It almost becomes
100%.
overwhelming
Yeah.
for the customer, right? Like they can't. It's too much. So that's why in the new year, I'm working on it right now. We want to offer like pre-made geometry essentially at a slightly better price than our customs. We're going to have a couple geometry tables for all road gravel, maybe even do two gravels, like the fast gravel and but that'll kind of like which is all road, which is
Yeah. Yeah.
gravel,
Having gone through my own
you know.
custom frame
And
journey,
just
like I
to
know
kind
you're
of
overwhelmed with choice all of a sudden. When someone says they can make you anything, all of a sudden it's hard not to become paralyzed. And it took me a
yeah,
while. And fortunately, I'm surrounded by lots of advisors in this front to help me, that helped me kind of just narrow down the constraints of what I wanted and then kind of work with the frame builder to say, yeah, this
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah. So our like easiest customers, fastest like time from first interaction to when the bike is built are people who have commissioned lots of custom
Yeah.
bikes already, right? They don't like they're not doubting their decision. They know what they're looking for. They know their fit. Um, so they're not belaboring these decisions of like, oh, what's a 0.2 degree difference on my head tube going to do, right? Like it's to them, it's not a big deal. So that's where someone said it to me at Made actually, is like, oh, what you want is freedom from choice in terms of like having the product, take this or leave it. That's, if you want to do the full custom thing, we can do that, but maybe it's easier for you to just cross shop geometry tables on like Bike Insights, and that's how you want to do it. So I need to kind of make that available for people. So yeah, it is totally overwhelming, and I think there's no customer interaction for me right now that isn't like one click buy on the website, right? Like there's a bunch of emails back and forth, there's drawing revisions, there's discussions about what you're looking for, what bikes you currently have, and what your goals are for the build. So yeah, it's involved, and that's part of the reason for shifting to like sort of the tiered model of like pre-built at one price and
Yeah.
full custom at another price, because there's a ton of time involved in custom where I can just like turn on the CNC machine and make the size 56 all road, and you get your
Yeah.
thing a couple weeks later. There's
You
no.
had mentioned in this conversation sort of this journey to becoming part of the bike industry. Is there anything that stands out that surprised you
Yeah.
about the way people buy bikes or what it's like being a bicycle manufacturer?
No, everything, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we talked about this a bit before we started, but yeah, like that's the whole side of it. That's a total mystery to me. Like I'm a like tech focused, fact based kind of person, and to try to navigate the mind of the consumer amidst all the information they're given from general marketing, and what's important, what's not. It's and convincing someone that what you're doing is worthwhile is really challenging. That's going to be the kind of crux of my success or failure. It's not like I think we make a good product, and I can't guarantee you.
No,
Sorry, I think my heater
no
just
worries.
kicked on in the shop. Did that come through
No
on
worries.
the microphone a bit? Okay. Um, so yeah, like that's going to be the make or break for me. Can I sell enough bikes to
Yeah.
keep the
Yeah.
lights
Yeah.
on doing that? So
It's so
I'm trying to
interesting
get
just
inside the.
watching your business over Instagram because you're so um, open about sharing your manufacturing process and open to engineering debates and discussions with would-be commenters on your Instagram stories that I do think, I mean, from an outsider's perspective,
Yep.
Jonathan, I think like you showcase the quality of your work in those discussions and you have always shown up in every story that I've
Thank
watched
you.
in our previous conversations. You show up as someone who's very thoughtful about the things you're doing. And obviously there are different ways of doing things, but you are clear about why you are doing things the way you are
Absolutely.
doing them.
Yeah, so that's always been what's worked for me is sort of the behind the scenes, lay it out for what it is. I think what a lot of people have told me in that sort of marketing branding thing is like you need to take it a step further. You need to not just show what you're doing, but you need to explain why it's good. And that's where I think I draw a little bit of a personal line because it's like I'm not I don't want to take it to I'm telling you what you should think. I want to leave it at let me show you
Yeah.
and you
And
decide for yourself. And I don't know if
yeah,
that's
I
like
think the challenge
yeah.
now, just my 2 cents is, given the small number of frames you have out there in the world, is just getting rider feedback, testimonials, reviews, other people riding bikes that are willing to comment on things like ride
Yeah.
quality to kind of bring it all together. Because as I just said, like I do think that you've established through your social accounts that trust in your skill as a manufacturer. Now people are just wanting to see, what do people say when they've got one of these underneath them?
Yeah, I've had people literally DM me and say like there I've got some review bikes out there with certain reviewers and I've had people say when so and so writes their
Yeah.
review, as long as it's
Yeah.
not bad, I'm buying a bike. It's like, okay, great. I think that's good that you need that little like last bit of confirmation that it's not a crapshoot. But like I'm over here kind of feeling a little vulnerable, to be honest. Like you put yourself out there. I'm selling bikes. I don't know what expectations I had in terms of how
Yeah.
fast sales would take off. I think like my wife keeps reminding me, like you've been doing this for a year. Like maybe you have unreasonable expectations. Just keep your head down and keep like doing good stuff. Um, so yeah, I think you're right. That'll just take a little bit of time, awareness.
Yeah. And then
Yeah, all those things of
I would
enough people
say, and I
riding them
maybe
that
I've
there's
missed this on your account, to the degree in which you are writing your own product and out there, just sharing a little bit of your own commentary. Again, like
yeah,
everybody's going to take it with a, hey, this is one rider, and maybe it's a very self-interested rider's perspective. But you
yeah.
always have struck me as someone who's honest. So I'm not thinking you're going to film a video of yourself riding a gravel trail saying this is the fastest bike it's ever been produced on earth.
So yeah, I might have given discredited myself already in this conversation in that regard of I wrote a fixie for the last 20 years, right? Like what's my frame of reference? I've said this to people and they look at me like, "Oh my god, this guy must be a total idiot." Where I say like, "I'm not a bike guy. Like I'm a cyclist, I love riding bikes, but I'm not a guy that's reading the magazines every month, seeing what the latest and greatest is or knowing what the trends are. Or like I'm kind of outside of all of that." So I think to your question about what are the biggest kind of shocks is yeah, the whole branding marketing side of it. I was I really underestimated that. I thought like a good product, a good well-made product is worthy of you know
Yeah.
at least consideration from a buyer, but there's so much information out
Yeah.
there, right? It's overwhelming and it changes all the time.
100%. I
So
mean,
it's
I think
like
what,
me saying I'm enjoying riding my bike. It's like, yeah, of course I'm going to say that.
oh man. Well, this is great, Jonathan. Just one final question on like the customer journey. Like if someone was to come to you with a custom project and assume that they kind
Yeah.
of are in the know and kind of understand the basics of what they want, once you kind of locked in design back and forth, how long does it take you to produce a bicycle? And are you typically selling a complete bike or just a frame?
So I'll answer the last part of that
Okay.
question first. We do both. I would say the farther away the bike's getting shipped, the less likely it is that it's a
Yeah.
complete, if that makes any sense. Like I'm in Canada, I'm sourcing components here. So our American customers, it might make more sense for them to work with their local shop to fill out the build and I just send the
Yeah.
framework and handlebars or whatever they're buying down there. Um, Local people have bought full builds. I've sent stuff, yeah, internationally as far as Japan more recently, and those are typically frames. So we do both. We do want to know about component
Yep.
compatibility, even if we're not the ones who are doing the full build. That's an important part of making sure everything works for the customer when they get it. So the way we work is we take a deposit, $500 right now, to reserve a spot in the build queue and to kind of do that back and start the discussion on what you're looking for. That deposit's non-refundable, but it gets applied to the balance of whatever the
Yeah.
build cost comes out to at the end. And from the approval, like some people approve same day, they know exactly what they want. I go to production later that day or the next morning. I would say it's typically about a month right now from start to finish to build the bike. Like it's not a lot of my time, but there's a bunch of steps where you wait in between. The main one being that I send the lugs out for plating for corrosion resistance, and that if I finish them on a Monday, I ship them out a Tuesday or Wednesday, get them back a week and a half later. In that time, I can have made the tubes. So yeah, it's our lead time right now is about 2 months. I think we've got a small backlog of orders to work through, some review bikes going out, and so we're pretty quick. I think like the theoretical throughput on what I can do in a year on our current equipment is like 200 bikes. So I don't expect to be selling that many. If I was,
well, we'll get you there in time, Jonathan. Very, very I'm excited to see this journey ahead of you.
Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'll put links to everything in the show notes so people know how to find you. Again, for the listener, definitely follow the Framework Bikes Instagram account, which I'll link to as well. You can get all the behind the scenes you're going to want. A friend of mine who tipped me off to your brand when we were at MADE called it manufacturer's porn, which I think is appropriate.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the website, it's there. It needs some work. Like I said, we're working on the kind of program for 2024 in terms of the stock sizes, throwing some more information up there. It's just really, it's a placeholder website right now. So definitely needs.
Indeed. Right on. Thanks for all the time, Jonathan.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this week's edition of the Gravel Ride Podcast. Big thanks to Jonathan from Frameworks for coming on board and telling us all about his journey and manufacturing process for those beautiful bikes. Additional thanks goes out to our friends at Hammerhead for sponsoring the show many times this year. Truly appreciate their support, as I couldn't do what I do without some of their underwriting. If you are able to support the show, a couple things you can do for me. Ratings and reviews are hugely appreciated. They really help with discoverability. Or if you're able to financially contribute to the show, simply visit buymeacoffee.com/thegravelride. Until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.